Good morning. We'd like to start this Greek event, and my name is Desmond Lochman. I'm a resident fellow here at the American Enterprise Institute, and it's my real pleasure to have everybody come to this event, which, just judging by the conversations that I've been having with the participants before the event, is likely to prove a very lively discussion, and I'm very much looking forward to it. It is often said that Greece is a small economy that is only something like 2% of the Europeans' overall GDP, so it's nothing much to worry about. Yet over the last few years and right now, there is concern about Greece, and it's concern not simply what might happen to Greece, but there's fear as to what the implications might be for the broader eurozone, not to mention the whole global economy. So as we're gathering right now to discuss the matter, this is going to be the key topic of discussion this weekend for those assembled here for the IMF meeting. The ministers of finance and the central bank governors will be talking about it. And I really feel very fortunate to have assembled such a great panel to discuss a matter that is really of great importance. My role is that of the moderator, so I'm not going to give my views on the subject if I can restrain myself. But I thought that what I might do is just frame the discussion by pointing out a few stylized facts, which are difficult to disagree with, and then pose a number of questions that I think arise from those stylized facts, which might guide the discussion. But of course, the panelists are free to discuss whatever aspect they like. So the first stylized fact that I'd say is that there's no question that over the past 6 years, Greece's economic performance has been disastrous. And I don't use that word lightly. If you just take a look at that chart, what that chart is doing is it's showing you Greece's GDP performance in relation to that of the United States during the Great Depression. And one sees that Greece's performance very closely parallels that of the United States up to now, yet there's no real sign that Greece is going to rebound the way in which the United States did. Of course, what that means is Greece's unemployment rate is in excess of 25%, youth unemployment 50%, and you get Greece in deep deflation now, prices falling at the rate of 2.5%. They're the ones at the bottom of the chart. Other countries in the eurozone nowhere nearly as bad. And then lastly, the debt, Greece's debt, despite a restructuring of the private debt, where the debtors' present value was written down by 75%, Greece manages to have a debt to GDP ratio of 175%. So that's really the first of the stylized facts, is that the economy is a real mess. The second stylized fact is that because of that economic mess, what you've had a political fallout that is really very important. So if you look back 5 years ago, the two centrist parties in Greece, the New Democracy and PASOK, they would get something like 70% of the vote. Today, they only get something like 25 if they're lucky. And what you've had extreme parties on both sides. And now, as we all know, since January the 25th, we've got a far-left Syriza government in place that is very much openly against the austerity type of measures and the economic reforms that are being imposed on it by the Europeans. So that would be the second stylized fact I'd mentioned. The third is that over the past 2 months, since this government has come into power, there have been attempts at negotiations, but if any of you were at Brookings yesterday and had the pleasure of hearing Mr. Schäuble and Mr. Varoufakis, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to know that there are a huge number of issues that are dividing the two sides. It looks like the two sides are looking at this in totally different ways, and it looks like these negotiations are stalled. Fourth stylized fact I'd mention is that it seems that the Europeans are now somewhat more confident, certainly than they were in 2012, that they think that they're very much better prepared to deal with a Greek accident than they were before. They're taking comfort in the fact that the spread levels of Greece, while interest rates, Greece is now paying something like 26, 27% for two-year money, whereas the Italians and the Spanish and the Portuguese and all the rest are borrowing at ridiculously low interest rates. The final stylized fact I'd say is all of this is playing out at the same time that politics in the rest of Europe looks very troubling. We're getting fragmentation across the board, and I'm thinking, not only of places like Spain, where you've got Podemos coming to power, but I'm thinking of places like France, where, someone like Marine Le Pen, a big anti-European, manages to get 25% of the polls and is a serious contender for the French presidential election in a couple of years. So much for the stylized facts. Let me now just say that the kind of questions that they raise in my mind, and hopefully we'll discuss them right now, is the first is how did Greece come to this terrible pass? What really was causing this? Is it that the Greeks were profligate? Is it that the German and French banks, through imprudent lending, facilitated this? Is it that the Troika, the IMF, the ECB, the European Commission came up with very bad policy prescriptions? Is that really what the story is? How do we apportion the blame for something of that kind? A second question that I'd have is, with what we know today, would it have been better for Greece to exit the euro some years ago? Or perhaps more pointedly now that Greece looks like it's on her way to default and capital controls, what are the arguments against Greece exiting the euro right now? I put that as a question. It's not a rhetorical question. The third question, that I think is really key right now is that if we do get an event in Greece, either default or capital controls or banks really melting down or Greece exiting, what is the risk of contagion, to the rest of the eurozone? Is this going to be simply a Greek event, or is it going to spread? Might this be something like a European layman event? The fourth question I have is are the Europeans indeed very much better equipped to deal with this now than they were before? They do have firewalls in place. How well tested are those firewalls? I'm thinking of the ESM, I'm thinking of the OMT of the ECB. They've got them in place, but can they really implement them if the political will is really vanishing? The last question that I'd have is, both for the IMF and the ECB, it would seem to me that both of them are going to be incurring losses on the large amount of money that they have lent to Greece. And the question is, what kind of lessons might they draw? How might that influence their behavior going forward? So those are the stylized facts and the questions I've got, and I'm now going to turn to the panel. I'm not going to introduce them at great length, mainly because I think you've got it on your handouts, and they really are highly distinguished and well-known in their own right, and they're going to talk in alphabetical order. So first, we're going to have Anne Krueger talking. Anne is a former first deputy managing director at the IMF. She was chief economist at the World Bank. She's got a highly distinguished academic record that would take us the whole morning to go through. So I'm really grateful that Anne is here. Ashoka Modi, who's writing prolifically on the eurozone crisis. I'd recommend his writings to any of you who haven't seen them. He's currently teaches at the at Princeton at the Woodrow Wilson School, but he's had a whole lot of experience at the IMF, used to lead IMF missions to Ireland, amongst other things, but really very familiar with the issues in Europe. Athanasios Orphanidis is also somebody who doesn't need an introduction. Many things that he's done. He's been central bank governor in Cyprus, on board at the ECB. He spent time at the Fed, he teaches at MIT, highly accomplished macroeconomist. And last, but certainly not least, is Plutarchos from the Athens University of Economics and Business, spent time as well at the Fed. And what really gives him an advantage over all of us is he's on the ground in Greece, and he's very familiar with the way in which had held a number of positions in the European economy, so that he's very familiar with thinking in Europe. So with that introduction, it's my pleasure to hand it over to Anne.
Do you want to stay here?
No, please.
Stay here, or stay here. Thank you very much, Desmond. You pushed it. There, okay. Thank you very much, Desmond. I'm happy to be here, although I'm more interested to hear what everybody else has to say. This is not something on which there are firm conclusions drawn by anybody, and given your questions, I'm reminded of an apocryphal, I'm sure, exam question at your old alma mater, Cambridge, which was define the universe and give 3 examples. That's almost what we're trying to do here in a short time, and it is a short time. So let me start by saying that obviously, in some sense, in the very long term, or even the medium long term, there's a lot that has to be done in Greece. There has to be a restructuring of the debt, I think, almost without question, which can take several forms, so I won't go into that. And certainly there has to be a restoration of growth. The question is how soon and how do you get there? And I will first just start by saying, trying to answer Desmond's first question quickly. Greece got there by basically increasing government increasing government spending greatly during the first years of the euro, in part because interest rates were lower, so borrowing was cheap, and that he gave room within the budget to do it. But secondly, and equally important, Greece for years has had perhaps more stringent interventions in the economy in the microeconomic sense, a large public sector and so on than most other European countries. It has the highest minimum wage of any country in Europe. There are a number of these things on the table that quite clearly do not bode well for growth until they are somehow resolved. The size of the public sector is big. The pension liabilities are unfunded liabilities are huge, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it is true they have done some things, but that's to me sort of like an alcoholic who's been consuming inordinate amount of alcohol every day, starting at 10 o'clock in the morning, saying, "I'm really on the mend. I'm not starting till 10:30." There's just excuse me, too much there that needs to be done that hasn't if Greece is to have healthier growth and better prospects in the future. I guess in the medium term, let's say the next 2 or 3 years, there are, I think, 4 possible outcomes. The first of which is that Greece actually reforms, it gets down to business, changes many of these things that are intervention, it gets its budget under control, there's some kind of addressing of the debt issue, et cetera, et cetera. At the moment, the odds on that are so small that I won't talk about it anymore. That does not seem to be the way things are drifting at the moment. The second, which is much more probable, is, and I start here with the background, that until now, since the formation of the European Union, and even before when it was just beginning, there has always been a political will, and when there has been an economic crisis, which has not been totally infrequent, the political will to stay together has dominated the vociferous tendencies that have come about because of the crisis. I have in mind the common agricultural policy, the British budget. There have been a number of these things, and every time it looked as if politics confronts economics, economics will win. politics is one, the staying together sense. Whether that will happen this time or not, I don't know, but certainly it is quite possible that there will be a muddling through in that each will stare the other in the eye, they will make terrible threats and so on, as they were and are doing, but that at the last minute there will be something done that's just enough to keep the game going until the next time when it happens again, until it happens again. And that could conceivably go on for quite a while. Whether it will happen or not is something, and of course that still raises questions. Is debt sustainable, which has to be addressed at some point? And quite clearly the answer, as debt is now structured, is at the moment, yes, because of course they're paying almost no debt service. But over time that has to change because obviously things will start rolling over and there will be issues that have to be refinanced. And right now in the secondary market, the interest rate is 25%. You can't roll over 177% of GDP at 25% interest without having a debt interest burden that's unsustainable, so we won't have that. Obviously, if the world economy picks up, there's a better chance of muddling through. There are a number of things that could help. But on the other hand, what's happened so far, I would guess that's maybe a 40% probability at best. As high as it is, not because the economics are good, but because of the political history, which I think is real. So there are really two other options, and I think that's what Desmond really wants us to address here. The first is an orderly exit, and the second is a disorderly falling apart. The orderly exit is probably, I would guess, and I have no inside knowledge whatsoever, someone here may have, but I don't. There's certainly things in the paper that suggest that the European Commission and others in Europe, the German finance ministry and so on, have looked at what that would do. And in that sense, they do feel they're better prepared, and they certainly are better prepared than they were 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 years ago. I mean, there have been preparations. They may not be adequate, but certainly the basis for fear of contagion and its consequences, while not absent, is less than it was. And if the exit were orderly, so that basically the Europeans were informed and it was done in an orderly way, that could be something that was done. It would be a shock on both sides, certainly for Greece and certainly for the European Union and the eurozone in particular, but it would not, I think, be as bad as what the fourth outcome, which is a disorderly exit. Now, the orderly exit, I would attach maybe a 15% at most probability to. Both sides don't want the exit to happen, which gives you some hope that maybe it won't, which is the muddling through strategy. But I think there's a severe risk of somebody either miscalculating or making a mistake or not seeing what's happening as it's happening. The most obvious trigger for such a thing would be deposits leaving the banking system or the government running out of money. Those are the two, and either or both could happen in the near term. It is not something that's a distant possibility. It's more real. The payments due in May and June are already big. We've already heard a lot of backing and forthing on those in the meetings here. We'll hear more about that, I'm sure. But the last I looked, deposits in the banking system were down to about 135 billion euros, which is less than they were when the crisis started. And money had flowed out at that point. So the authorities could be motivated by rescuing a collapsing banking system. They could be motivated simply by running out of money. They will have problems, obviously, in the short term with things such as paying the pensioners. And those sorts of things are political dynamite. So it's quite possible that they would sort of very quickly, one Friday night, close the banks, close the exchange markets, and go quickly. And I worry in that case as to how much of an orderly plan they would have, which I suspect is not as good as it could be, and how much the EU would be hit. The European Union and especially the eurozone countries would obviously take something of a hit because obviously they have obligations in Greece. It would be messy because there are lots of Greeks who have debts that are owed in euros in other countries, some for mortgages, some for other things. And of course, businessmen would have problems with credit immediately in any kind of deal across the border, and so on and so forth. Exchange control would be inevitable in that case, I think, and inevitable immediately, and especially in the startup phase, that itself could contribute greatly to a deteriorating economy because there are so many people who get caught. unable to do what they need to do, even in the very short run, and paying obligations when they had the local currency, which is the euro, of course, on Friday, and by Monday they can't pay because it's not there because of exchange control. So there is a serious risk, I think, of a mistake either that way or one side or the other misreading the other side enough so that they take on a stance that is too offensive, too confrontational, or appears determined to meet their fate kind of thing, in a way that then the other side just stops looking at ways to find even a short-term way out. So those would be my worries as to what would happen. Obviously, the disorderly exit is, I think, both for the Greeks and for the European, the eurozone and the European Union, the worst possible outcome. I think it's about equally likely with the muddling through. Between those two, I would give a stronger probability than the others. Now, increasingly, miscalculations seem to me to be coming into play already. It is a new government, and new governments that have never been in power before almost always have trouble getting their acts together. They have ministers who've never been ministers. They have a prime minister who's never tried to coordinate a contentious, fractious cabinet. This is a coalition. All reports suggest that there's not exactly harmony between all the members of the coalition. A possible outcome is that somehow or other they somehow buy some time, there's another election, or otherwise they get a reshuffling of the parties to some government that may do more. But even if there's another government, whether it will do what I would call enough to meet the conditions at this stage seems to me to be even more questionable than it was a couple of months ago. Enough has happened that have raised people's hackles in ways that make negotiations more difficult. Question 2, and Desmond's listed, I'll go through quickly, was should Greece have exited? I would argue that one of the big mistakes was probably not restructuring the debt earlier in return for a much stronger program than was in fact adopted. I think it would have been painful even so, but it would have been much more short-term pain and much more long-term gain already. The 6 or 7 years that have gone by since the beginning of the crisis are really something that obviously has exacerbated everything political. Certainly Greece has lost, the rest of Europe has lost, and ways to get through it sooner are fine. But it had to be faced that Greece had to really restructure its public finances. It had to do a number of other things, and a very strong program in that regard would be different. By the way, one of the austerity arguments is, one of the arguments today that austerity has caused all this. My problem with that is that until last year, Greece was not on net paying any interest even. Greece was, in fact, borrowing more than enough to cover the interest. And when Greece started austerity, the fiscal deficit was 15% or thereabouts of GDP, the prospective one. And they had no way of covering it. Now, there was going to be austerity. Let's imagine there had been no international help whatsoever. I guarantee you the austerity that first year would have been far worse. What would have happened after that, you could argue about a bit. But at least at the beginning, the need for some resources in order not to have the severe political dislocation and economic dislocation was, I think, clear. But I think in return, there should have been a much stronger effort or a much stronger program, the difficulty being, of course, that the politics weren't there because of the government. If there is a Grexit, what was the likelihood of contagion? Obviously, there'll be some. Will there be enough in the short run? I doubt it. I think that, yes, there will be a hit, but not that bad. But I'll say one more thing about that at the end. Is Europe as a whole better off under what circumstances with a Grexit? Well, getting this behind them somehow perhaps is better than dragging it out forever. I don't know, but keeping it just hanging there is, I think, a drag on everybody. Would the ECB and so on suffer losses, incur losses? Well, the ECB can offset that, I think, by its own actions. I would worry more about the losses of the member governments and so on. And that will be a problem. Obviously, at that stage, some restructuring would be a rephasing of the debt so that debt payments would become due later. But my last comment, and I'm running out of time, would be the following, namely, that all of this is short run, and as you can hear, much as I don't see much for Greece's prospects, I'm not that worried about the European Union on that count. It has discovered we have discovered that their decision-making mechanisms may need some improvement. Some things have been done, but there are probably more to need done. The more worrisome thing, though, it seems to be, is precedent. If there's a Grexit, what happens when the next country gets into difficulty? What does that do for confidence in the eurozone as a whole and everything that goes with that? And if one looks at the finances of some of the large countries, that they might get into trouble is not fanciful at all. And if that were to happen, it's a very different ballgame all the way around. So I think the answer to your question is if, in the short run, probably the damage to the rest of Europe is not that great. In the longer run, though, it may be the end of the euro experiment. I'll stop there.
Thank you. And just before I turn it over to Ashoka, if matters do get disorderly and Greece defaults on its official debt and is forced to introduce capital controls, presumably the Greeks can still choose to do all of that and still remain within the euro. That they could do, for instance, like what Cyprus did. It doesn't necessarily follow that, the fact that they might not come to an agreement right now, they default and they forced to impose capital controls. It's really the Greeks' choice as to whether or not they...
But they don't have any money in that scenario. How are they going to finance the government without their own currency?
Well, I think that right now, the fact that they're running a small primary surplus...
If they are.
Right.
And if they continue to under that circumstance.
Right. Ashoka.
What do I need to do?
Just press the button.
Okay. Right. So I will make 3 observations. First, there's a lot of noise in this Greek debate. And there are lots of things which are very enticing to talk about, but they are noise and we should not be wasting time on them. The second is that there's one real problem, and that's the core of the problem, that Greek debt is too high and something needs to be done about it. And the real question is, how does one address Greek debt? And my third observation is that there is no resolution or meeting of the minds on that, because the policies that are being advocated for the resolution of Greek debt do not work. The economics of that does not work. And there is a commitment to those policies which makes it impossible that it will work. And therefore, my third observation will be to make some predictions on what will happen. So, number one, on the noise, I think Greek exit is a noise. Greek exit will not happen. Nothing in life will not happen. There's always some possibility it will, but I think I take the Barry Eichengreen view that Greek exit would be Lehman squared, and there is certainly the notion that Greek exit, there's an orderly Greek exit, is an oxymoron. And that even if there is no immediate contagion, there will be a long-term contagion which will basically unravel the European eurozone over a period of time, and no one is going to take that risk. The second element of noise is, what did the Greeks do? The Greeks lived beyond their means, they violated every rule. That's all correct. But it's a waste of time to reflect on that. We need to ask the question, where do we go from here? And in particular, the fascination with the characters who are now running Greece is again good for gossip, but basically any Greek government, and this is my most serious point, any Greek government will have to deal exactly with the issues that these guys are dealing with, which is, how do we get Greek debt down to a point where the debt overhang allows a resumption of growth. So my main theme is that the combination of high debt, fiscal austerity, and structural reform, which is basically the Troika package, that you do austerity, do structural reform to grow, and over time you will repay the debt. That does not work. That simply does not work. There is no historical precedent of that working. If world growth picks up by some miracle, then anything works. Then you don't need a program. But the presumption that there will be a pickup in world growth at this point and that therefore that will solve the problem. That will solve the problem, but that's not the strategy. Austerity does not work is clear. Even the Europeans have now figured that out. But the more interesting thing is this elixir called structural reforms, where there is this notion that if we do something called structural reforms, there will be growth. There is zero evidence for that. For those of us who have been part of the practitioning world and who have studied papers by Bob Gordon on the nature of labor market reforms and such like, know that at best, these structural reforms over a medium term may have some plausible benefits. But we don't know that. We don't know that. And the best evidence is that they can actually make things worse even in the medium term, and certainly in the short term. If you add to the deflationary pressures that are already there, you're going to make things even worse. So the basic Troika package is inconsistent. That hold your breath, do structural reforms, do a little bit of fiscal austerity, over time you will repay the debt. That's simply not, in my view, a plausible scenario. Therefore, there is no question in my mind, and this is where Anne began actually her statement. She said it's a given that there has to be restructuring of debt. Therefore, it is my view too that there has to be a restructuring of Greek debt. The official debt is way too high. The fact that the interest rates are low does not really matter very much at this point in my mind. A, because there are going to be spikes of repayment like we are going through right now, which will create a lot of interest and tension whether it will be repaid or not. But over a medium term, remember that the fact that the nominal interest rate is low is interesting only to the extent that there is no deflation. So if Greece has 2.5% deflation, then its real interest rate is a lot higher than the nominal interest rate suggests, and that is the reason why Greek debt keeps going up. The Greek debt keeps going up even though there has been all kinds of modification to Greek debt, is because if you have a debt deflation spiral, which is essentially the outcome of the strategy that has been pursued, you're not going to reduce Greek debt. And so in a few years, you will again be asking, just like Anne just said, in 5 years ago, in April of 2010, when these discussions were being held, there was this question, should we restructure Greek debt or not? It was obvious to a lot of people that Greek debt should be restructured. I think 5 years from now, if we are having this discussion, it'll be obvious to people that Greek debt should have been restructured at this point in time in a substantial way. And this is not a moral issue. This is basically fundamentally an economic issue. Can we have a process by which Greeks begin to have some prospect of growth? Therefore, because there is no willingness at this point to do it, let me make a few predictions of what will happen. Essentially, what will happen is exactly what we've been doing for the last 5 years. We will have a number of bogus deals where there'll be some minor reduction in Greek debt. We saw this in a number of occasions over the last couple of years. It'll be very much like the pattern that is being followed on ELA, which is the emergency loan agreement, where every few weeks the ECB allows a little bit more in a drip way. Something similar but at a lower frequency will happen on the Greek public debt. There will from time to time be what I call the invocation of the André Saz axiom, André Saz being a senior Dutch central banker. And Saz said something that everyone should think about, that when Europeans have compromises, they agree on the words, but they interpret the words completely differently. And that's essentially what will happen. That was the February 25th agreement. There was a brief moment when everybody agreed on the words, and about 2 hours later, there were completely different interpretations. I think periodically what will happen is there'll be a little bit of debt forgiveness of Greece. There will be an André Saz moment, and then there will be again a recreation of the revival of the same problem. This is the scenario that I visualize as the muddling through process. This is how the muddling through will occur. And if that is how it occurs, the cost will not just be to Greece. The cost will be a broader cost to the vision of the sort of idealistic vision of Europe as an entity that folds its citizens in one umbrella. And therefore, as far as I'm concerned, it will be a slow but gradual erosion of the European project. And that's the larger cost of acting in the short-term interest right now, is that those who are focused on today and what Greece must do and how it must repay its debts, I think are making a bigger mistake, which is that they are going to contribute to an unraveling, therefore, of the European project. I'm just going to say one last thing, which is, what would I do if I could do things my way? And let me just be clear that this is a completely outlandish idea, but I think it's logically consistent and therefore merits at least 1 minute of time, which is that Greek debt, official debt, should essentially be forgiven. You don't want to forgive it because writing it down seems an anathema, but you can say to the Greeks, pay us back in 100 years. And that's essentially writing it off. At that point, what happens is the Greek debt becomes, effective debt burden becomes so low that even the Greeks will be able to borrow in private markets. The reason they cannot borrow today, even if they were running a sound fiscal policy, is that if you have 170% of debt to GDP, there's nobody who's going to lend to you. And the second important point at that point is that you need then to get rid of the Brussels, Berlin, Frankfurt, Washington supervision of Greece. That is essentially the most corrosive part of this whole arrangement. At that point, the Greeks, when they issue their own private debt, should be on their own through mechanisms that can be clearly specified. And that unless a complete disengagement of Greece from European supervision is undertaken, this Greek tragedy will continue, and it will continue to undermine both Greece and Europe.
Thank you very much. Ashoka, just from a point of clarification, you say definitely there's not going to be a Greek exit, but you're not excluding the possibility that they default on their official loans or that capital controls come in?
Well, I'm encouraging the idea that they should default on their official loans. And I don't see what the connection between defaulting on official loans and Greek exit is.
Oh, I thought that you could draw a distinction. You can default on your loans and still maintain the currency.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what I'm saying. I am saying that there should be no Greek exit because there cannot be a Greek exit. And they should default on their loans, and that is the way to go forward.
Okay. Thank you. Athanasius. Oh, sorry. Hopefully there's somebody who can... Oh, maybe just click and see what happens. There you go.
Thanks a lot. This one, yeah. Thanks a lot. It's a pleasure to be here. But I have to say, I'm a little bit uncomfortable because by now I'm the third speaker. I thought we were gonna hear two extremely optimistic views about what's going on, so I could actually, tone it down a little bit. And this is gonna be difficult based on what I heard. So, but I thought I would focus on the first of your questions to give a different color to the discussion, and this is on the alternative narratives on the crisis and why this has been an important factor for the animosity we see that really makes finding a solution to this problem so difficult. And I'm going to start by having a picture very close to the one you started with, Desmond, because your introduction was very useful. The way I think I look at the crisis is by saying that this has been a wonderful crisis for some. This has been catastrophe for others. But it's not the case that this has been a crisis where everybody has been a loser. What we have seen in Europe is a very, very clear separation. Most countries have been losers. Greece, by far the largest one, but not everybody. We actually have in the euro area, 1/3 of the euro area has done exceptionally well, even better, mind you, than the United States that has done very well since 2010, after the global financial crisis. And the issue is to understand this part of the dynamic and connect it to the narrative of the story. So you were asking what happened in Greece. And I want to focus a little bit on the original scene that has been talked slightly about in May 2010. So we all know, this is clear, and Anne described this very well, that there was a problem of bad policies in Greece before 2010. We know that. That's no problem. The euro construction contributed to that, but there were major problems that needed to be corrected. So how do you correct problems when you figure out that a country is unsustainable? Well, usually what we've learned since the Second World War is that you go to the IMF and you ask for help. And this is what should have happened in this case. This is what started happening in this case. Greece needed IMF assistance, but there was a glitch. What was the glitch? Well, there was this uncomfortable element that Greece shared a currency with some other countries. And that created a new precedent. Could the IMF actually implement a normal program on Greece? Or was it the case that it should first negotiate with the other governments? Was it the case that the IMF could just deal with the finance ministry in Greece and the central bank of Greece? Oh, which one is the central bank of Greece? Is that in Athens or in Frankfurt? So the normal IMF procedure was actually brought into question, and that gave a lot of leverage to others to be involved. And what we saw, unfortunately, in retrospect, is that other European governments got in the game of designing what should have been a normal IMF program. And in particular, the German government, being the largest and most important in the euro area, had a very big role, which is unusual. You know, if Romania gets in trouble and needs an IMF program, the German government cannot veto really what the IMF is doing with Romania. In this case, the first example of a country in the euro area, we actually had this additional interference. As a result, we got these programs that, as Ashoka pointed out, they kind of don't make much sense. And you say, is this something we didn't know? Is this something that perhaps when we evaluate, how did we get to this situation where for the last 5 years, we have a country under IMF direction performing about as well as the US during the Great Depression? And my answer to begin with is that, well, don't look at the IMF for this. The problem is we did not let the IMF handle this the way the IMF would have handled it. And we need to reflect on whether we want to continue with the same solutions, which brings me back a little bit to what Ashoka was pointing out about what the modeling through strategy would be. But let me show you some numbers about what happened. So this is the original program. See, nicely coming down. I'm just showing you the pictures from the May 2010 program until 2015. There was going to be a very, very drastic fiscal consolidation. This is the austerity part, unheard of, 15 percentage points of GDP. But that's okay. You know, you would get, of course, a drop in GDP, but after 3 years, you would start growth. And of course, you are going to get an increase in unemployment. But look, 15% unemployment to do the correction that was needed for the excesses of the past, that's fine. That's not a problem. What happened? Well, the Greek government actually delivered exactly on the austerity that it was asked to do. Here you have from the October 2014 WEO, the deficit to GDP ratio as it materialized, plus the projection for 2015. The WEO that was published a couple of days ago has virtually the same data, so no changes there. You see, so if you look at it this way, you say, maybe the Greek government actually did do its part, at least on the fiscal consolidation part. Did it get the rest of what was supposed to happen? Well, the unemployment rate kind of went to almost 30%. Youth unemployment exceeded 50%, still above 50%. So something didn't add up, as Ashoka pointed out, which perhaps people inside the IMF could have already told you that in 2010. Real GDP didn't quite do the path. The interesting thing about real GDP is that, remember, 2015 is a projection here. So, you know, you always are optimistic in the projection. I very much doubt we are going to get this projection on 2015 GDP, but that's a different story. Then you have this very, very interesting notion of where debt to GDP is. Now, remember, the original program, debt was sustainable, so no haircut was needed. Then somehow the German government engineered a haircut of the Greek debt. Now, you know, I'd like to ask people who have familiarity with how the IMF works, how can you engineer a haircut of the debt that, as Desmond told us, was 75% of present discounted value and end up with a higher debt to GDP ratio? So is this how the IMF usually designs haircuts on debt? Of course, we know what happened here. What happened here again is that we collectively, all of the institutions involved, all of the governments involved, we permitted the German government and others to be very, very highly selective about which debt would be haircut and which debt would be protected. So, for example, if you were a pension fund in Greece, your Greek debt was effectively written on completely. But a bunch of other entities that the German government wanted to protect, fully protected. So you have this issue about even the imposition of a haircut was done in a way that was perhaps done in as badly as could be done. And this leads us to the narratives. What are the narratives of the crisis? What is causing the problem right now? So you have the Berlin narrative that says German taxpayers have been financing Greek profligacy since 2010. I'm not going to say before 2010. That could have been fixed with the IMF without Germany's involvement. Since Germany got involved in May 2010, this is the narrative. Germany has been financing the Greeks. The Greek governments have not been delivering. The Greek governments must engineer further austerity and deliver on whatever Berlin wants, otherwise they don't belong in the euro. And that's the narrative that we hear. That's one narrative. There is the other narrative that says, well, now wait a minute. Germany actually apparently exploited its power to block a normal IMF program and impose excessive debt to the Greek people. We ended up throwing Greece into a debt trap. we have these austerity policies that don't work, as Ashoka pointed out. The only way to get out of this is to actually have the German government accept its responsibility for what has happened and find out a workable compromise. Now, these narratives are very, very different. And I think one of the problems we have that we need to tackle is that if people talk across each other and they are not willing to respond to the other side's narratives, there is no way we can find a solution to this. And you can make your own. You can have your own views about what the most correct narrative is. I think that there are elements of truth in both of these narratives. To tell you the truth, but I thought it would be interesting to remind you what the IMF's view happened to be after that. The IMF did an evaluation of the program in 2013, and in very fine language that, with my past policy experience a few blocks from the IMF in Washington, I know what it means. However, there were also notable failures, and of course there were notable successes. And there are also these political economy lessons to be learned. Okay. So the IMF pretty much admitted that this was a catastrophic failure and said so in the language that is appropriate to say that in a document. And the question is, if you do that, then you ask, well, why did that happen? Why did that happen? And for that one, I'm thankful to former central bankers. So you have the former president of the Bundesbank who explained this to us in one sentence already in 2010. The whole idea of the Greek program was to protect German banks, but especially, since he's German, he's going to blame the French banks from debt write-offs. So if you start from that premise, so instead of allowing the IMF to design a program the way it should have been designed, and you start from the premise of allowing the German government to design the parameters of the program so that German banks can be protected from losses, then you get a mess. And then actually everything makes sense. Now, what was even more fascinating, that was not known at the time, but El País disclosed that last year, is that we have information from internal IMF documents about what happened at the IMF board meeting in May of 2010, where apparently a very explicit commitment was made by the German government and other governments that could have made the Greek debt sustainable and could have lent a little bit of credibility to the original program, but that commitment relied on the German banks maintaining their exposure to Greece. And one can ask, was that commitment honored? One can ask that question, and we know the answer. So the issue is, if we say, where are we now and who's to blame? I'm going to come to that. Clearly, the Greek government started the problem before May 10, clearly. Then you have the euro construction, which is a collective, massive failure. It's actually what allowed Greece to get as unbalanced as it was. And that's a joint responsibility, and Greece was not the only country that got messed up as a result of the euro construction. But then once you say we reached 2010, what has happened to Greece since then? Is that really the fault of the Greek government, or is it the fault of someone else? And that's the following question. We say that someone is to fix what has happened. Who is responsible for paying? Because you actually need real resources to restore health in the Greek economy and make Greece get out of this debt trap that it has been. Is there any responsibility at all for any of the European institutions involved? I shall not name them. Is there any responsibility at all of other European governments? This is the question I pose. So the session was, does Greece pose the session title was, does Greece pose a threat to the euro? And frankly, I would like to turn this around a little bit. And the question is, who is posing a threat to the euro? I mean, I look at this crisis for the past 5 years, and like Ashoka, I'm very worried that the euro in its current form is a more fundamental threat to the European Union project. This is not just about the currency anymore. We had a project that was advancing Europe, that was working in okay manner, and I think this is now unwinding. So I'm not worried anymore about the euro disappearing and not existing as a currency in its current form. I'm not worried about that. I'm worried about the future of Europe more broadly. And I could say that we can all agree that actions of a specific government have exploited the euro to benefit their own constituencies to the detriment of Europe. I think we can all agree with that statement. The question is, which government is that? And how do we think about going forward? Because if we identify the wrong government in this, and we still have a government that is creating damage in the medium long term, then how can we hope to have any improvement in the project? And that's why I'm asking, think about the narrative. Which narrative should we be discussing if we want the solution? Berlin versus Athens.
Thank you very much for that, Athanasios. May I just ask one question, because I think both you and Ashoka really alluded to it. Clearly you're correct in suggesting that had there been a large debt restructuring up front, you wouldn't have needed the fiscal adjustment. It would have facilitated matters for Greece. But are you being fair to the European policymakers in the choices that they had to make at the time? In the sense, this was coming shortly after the Lehman crisis. The banking system globally was extremely fragile. You were concerned about writing down debt, what that might do to the rest of the banking system. Did you really have that option, or was it a case of Europe really just deciding we've got to sacrifice Greece for the greater good?
Sure. Let me address this a little, because I didn't cover it in my introductory remarks. First of all, I should note that I'm closer to Anne rather than Ashoka on the fact that you need to correct your fiscal finances. I agree with Ashoka that austerity, the way it has been implemented in Greece, is hopeless. This just doesn't make any economic sense. The IMF actually told us that in revising the multipliers that they were using in all programs in the euro area. So that's one element. But you do need the fiscal correction. You will have some pain. That was unavoidable in May of 2010. Then the IMF staff, as we now know, now it's in the public, back then it was not in the public, the IMF staff was suggesting that a haircut of the Greek debt would have been the better option. It's not clear that you needed a very large haircut of the Greek debt at that time. I mean, I have the impression that something like a 20% haircut would have been enough, but I don't know. I would trust more the IMF staff to tell me what the right answer is on this one than anybody anywhere in the continent. I'm going to start from that. Then the question you're posing is the following. Would it have been a good idea to have any restructuring, since that would have had contagion effect in other entities in Europe? And that's a crucial question. I would say that first we needed to understand what the consequences would have been. So, for example, we could have quantified at the time, the IMF could have easily done that, how many billion of euro it would cost to German banks if the IMF program was implemented. How many billion euro it would cost to French banks. These two were the two major players. And then you say, maybe we do not want to have a haircut on Greece because we can find a more economical way for the system overall of ensuring stability and correcting Greece. I could have seen that outcome as justifiable, but if the idea of not having a haircut on Greece was indeed in order to help France and Germany, then we should have also asked the question at the same time, what is the financial contribution of the French government and the German government, since it's their countries that are getting most of the benefit of deviating from the IMF program. And I could have envisioned a situation where the debt would have taken an official form, French loans, German loans, because this is what would have suited the system overall. No haircut, no contagion, but the French and German loans should have been along the lines of the solutions that you've already mentioned, essentially writing off the debt. So instead of having a public haircut, write it off by transferring it to the German and French treasuries in a manner that would be politically acceptable and solve the contagion. So I could see the systemic argument for taking the decision to not haircut the Greek debt in 2010, but then someone would need to pay for it so that the Greek program could still be designed in a reasonable manner and be sustainable the way the IMF would have done it. And that has not been done.
Just add to that, the latest IMF debt restructuring paper says exactly that. It says that if you believe that there is a public good, that will prevent preventing contagion is a public good, then there should have been a large grant to Greece to write off its debt, because it was not just Greece's problem, it was a global problem, and a global problem needs to be dealt with a grant, not with a loan.
Plutarchos will get to
Yeah.
you.
Two things quickly. One, Germany did not do well after the beginning of the euro, as everyone knows, and they undertook a fairly substantial reform program, which was quite painful, from about 2003 to about 2006, which basically lowered their unit labor costs and so on and so forth. And a lot of Germans at the time were disadvantaged greatly. I have some friends, in fact, both of whom expected to retire on reasonable pensions and so on, and their pensions were cut, and so et cetera, et cetera. So the Germans had been through a restructuring of some sort, which is part of the opposition of many Germans to the Greek program, because they discovered the Greek pensions were higher than German pensions in many cases, at a much earlier age, et cetera, et cetera. So there was some politics behind that, which I think cannot completely be ignored to say that Athens should be let completely off the hook. The second thing is, if you buy the argument there should have been a grant of real resources in 2008 or 2010, who should have paid those resources? The German taxpayer, the French taxpayer? There is a real problem there, too.
Plutarchos.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm definitely going to give a bit of a different perspective on this from the point of view of really looking forward, even though I think the discussion of what happened in the past is extremely important. So what we have here is a situation of a financial hurricane that basically hit a totally antiquated economic system and political system. And this hurricane is self-propagating itself into, once again, arriving into a situation where we can talk again about exiting the euro, with all the dire consequences that I'm going to argue later on this would have for the Greek economy, at least, even though I think I agree with many of the opinions earlier about this not being contained only in Greece. So what we have right now is we have a game of chicken being played between two parties that have been on this for 5-6 years now. Only the problem, from my point of view, is that one party is basically riding on a bicycle and the other party is riding on a motorcycle. So what do you have then? How is this going to basically evolve? And there are a couple of factors that I look at when I try to see, what is the resolution to this. And one factor is the financial factor. And it has to do with the sources of funding of the Hellenic Republic and the sources of funding of the banking system in Greece. And the second factor, very important one, is a political one. Which has to do with the existence or not of a mandate from the Greek electorate to stay in the euro, whatever it takes. And those are the two things that I think will guide my thinking later on. So regarding the first one, the funding issue, there's a hard deadline from my point of view. And that hard deadline is the end of June. because July, August, there's just too huge payments to really even think about internal financial repression, being able to finance those. But there's also an uncertainty in there, and that has to do with us, nobody really, probably not even the General Accounting Office in Greece, knowing how far the internal financial repression that is happening in Greece in unprecedented terms for the Greek economy, how far it can secure financing for its internal and its external needs. So you may have that this deadline moves forward and it's not end of June. If that deadline, in my opinion, ever gets met, this would definitely lead to at least bank holidays, capital controls, restrictions on withdrawals of deposits, and so on. What is the second element, the political element, telling me? We have 70 to 80% of the Greek people saying that they want to stay within the euro, whatever it takes. At the same time, they didn't give the mandate to the present government, the coalition, to do whatever it takes to stay within the euro. So from my point of view, once you hit the wall of having run out of money and being able to basically just start protecting yourself because you don't have the money to pay internally and or externally, you have to go back to the people. I think this government, in my thinking and in my scenario, will have to go back to the people, either in the form of a plebiscite or in the form of a new popular vote, and basically get the mandate to do whatever it takes to stay within the euro. And I'm going to talk about what I think it is that Greece should be doing in order to stay within the euro. The second thing I will be talking about, and this will give my own personal and maybe more Greek perspective, is that I'm going to argue that it is in Greece's best interest for its medium to long run growth to stay within the euro. And I'm going to argue in one particular way, and that is knowing fully well and agreeing fully with those who spoke before me about the really huge flaws in the architecture of the common currency. So why is that? The key question I'm addressing when I'm answering, this is, what does it take for Greece to grow? What does it take for Greece to grow in the medium term and in the long term? And is it more likely for this to happen within the institutions of the eurozone or outside of the institutions of the eurozones? And I turned the growth question, as Steve knows very well from his past, and my past is, what does it take to bring productivity growth? Whether you look at it TFP, total factor productivity growth, or average labor productivity growth, what does it take for this country, which is truly not a productive country, to achieve that growth? And we know from, let's say, for sure the American, but not only the American experience, that growth basically happens, let's say, out of two things. One thing is, we're all familiar, you have technology, innovation, you do things differently. But then, very importantly, it's the Schumpeterian process of creative destruction, the ability of resources, labor capital, to move from less productive to more productive resources. So are there these institutions in Greece for this to happen? Are there the institutions for this kind of productivity growth to happen? And the answer is no. And this is not a new problem. It's a problem that has been there for decades and has to do with inefficient civil service, unproductive and corrupt state sector, political and oligarchic elite, very bad supervision of Greek banks that allowed the credit boom that happened, that we talked about, and contributed to the bust that happened, and many other things. Then where are these institutions, these flawed institutions, more likely to be reformed? And this is the kind of structural reform that I would like to talk about, the structural reform that I indeed think could bring medium-term and long-term growth. I think that in an environment that is largely uncoupled and independent of the European Union, this is very much unlikely to happen. And I certainly think that any Grexit, any exit from the eurozone, will be the beginning of, at best, a two-speed Europe, where the second speed, which would definitely include Greece, would be a very marginalized European country that would be free of what I call the compass and the straitjacket of Europe. For me, the compass of Europe and the straitjacket of Europe is very important. I don't trust the current ruling elite to basically be able to bring about the reform that is needed for productivity to happen. Now, what is the... I have here also some things to say about, are there any short-term benefits from Grexit? And I say no, but given the time, I leave that for later. I'm a strong believer that Grexit is terrible for the short term also for Greece, for financial reasons. But more importantly, I have here a question. Okay, so what is the honorable compromise that will prevent Grexit and restore the economy on the path of growth, which I understand, as I explained to you earlier, this productivity growth that depends on the Schumpeterian process, on innovation, on technology, and so on. And in my mind, this honorable compromise includes a couple of elements. First, certainly less fiscal austerity, which includes debt restructuring. How much, in what form, that depends really a lot on how growth happens in the short and medium term, and also will, likewise, it's the chicken and egg question, affect how growth happens in the short and medium terms. But this less fiscal austerity has to be coupled with more growth-enhancing reforms. But what kind? So a Greece that basically just has less fiscal austerity, less debt overhang and so on, is not, in my opinion, the Greece that will grow because of the reasons that I tried to explain earlier. On the less fiscal austerity part, I think that primary surpluses of 1.5% are doable in an environment where you're growing, and in an environment that you don't have as much of a debt overhang as was talked about earlier. What's more important for me really is the commitment, which really did not exist in the first two bailouts of Greece, on these growth-enhancing reforms, which have to be, for example, reconstruction of the public sector. And I say reconstruction, not just reforming. The public sector in Greece really needs reconstruction. Reforming of the political system, possibly even by constitutional change, and improving the business environment. Now, improving the business environment is really, for me, the easiest to talk about, both as a former lender to long-term investments and now as an executive director of businesses that work in this business environment in Greece. It has to be things that make investment easier, more profitable, and I mean particularly greenfield investment. Okay, not just portfolio investment. And just to tell you some things that maybe by now you're aware of, but in case you're not, it's good to mention. Important things like land registry. How many of you do you know that in Greece we don't have a fully fledged functioning land registry? How can you do greenfield investment without that? Forest maps, spatial planning for land use, completely incomplete. You see that it's a total minefield. If you're a greenfield, someone wanted to do a greenfield investment, project finance, trying to get there. Justice, delivery of justice really needs to be sped up. A friend of mine says, justice delayed is justice denied. And this is really what is happening to a large extent to investors in Greece. Stability in the tax code, improvement in the tax administration. Since I'm an educator, I've been all my life, better educational system. I mean, these are really things that are, I think, neither impossible nor implausible under any circumstances. And you will see that I'm not talking here about the tough stuff that everybody talks about, the labor and the pension reform. Not that I don't think that it's essential, probably in different forms, but because I think that there are things that in all of those measures that I mentioned earlier, that even the current government would find to be total no-brainers. Final question, and I will try to finish there so that I can hear some of the reactions. I have no doubt that the Europeans will accept such a compromise as I described it here. My key concerns are, will the Greeks accept this kind of compromise? And the way I see it here, I'm both hopeful and fairly confident that they would. But I think that this doesn't just involve, the prime minister going in front of the public and saying that, okay, now please give me, your consent. It has to be through something more drastic, like either a plebiscite of some form or a political vote. And I finish with what I said earlier, that I strongly think that Greece, as it is structured right now and as its economy is right now, really needs both the compass and the straitjacket of Europe. It may have lots of flaws, but it's a lot better than what we can do on our own.
Thank you very much for that, Plutarchos. Given that the hour's a little bit late, what I suggest is I'll throw it open to questions. What I'll do is I'll gather the questions and then we'll go through the panelists. So, if you can just take note of what the questions are. Do we have any microphones or? Oh, okay. If you could just identify yourself as well.
Okay. My name is Andreas Hermes. I'm from the German Finance Ministry. And I'm, as a lawyer, certainly not raising suspicion to contribute to the economic discussion. But I can perhaps contribute a little bit about the political surrounding. I could agree very much to Mr. Modi's first remarks. I would say the second part, a lost track of reality a little bit. But Mr. Sakelaris filled the gap. And I just want to tell you how the perception of the German politics is perhaps. It is about politics. We are not talking about economy. In the first instance, it is about politics. And therefore, there will be no Brexit unless the Greek people will decide that they want to leave. But we can't see why they should. The crisis has boosted European unification to an extent which we would not have perceived in 2005 to 2007. When the financial crisis turned into a debt crisis, I worked in the Chancellery as director in the European Department, and we were wondering what the European course will be in the future. And it was dramatic.
Yeah. You'll be short of time. If I could ask you if you've got a question.
Okay. So my question then would be, don't you underestimate the political surrounding of what we are doing compared to the economic questions that have to be solved? Do you really understand that the European, especially the eurozone, is more a state than it is not?
Thank you. Okay, the gentleman behind. Okay, if we could try to keep the comments really short and come to the question.
Yes, I was wondering, since you were talking about failed IMF programs, if it would be worth comparing Greece to Argentina, and whether Argentina is a plausible possible outlook for Greece, not necessarily the best one, but some way that we could see Greece going in the future.
Thank you. Bert.
Thank you. Bert Ely, banking consultant and longtime Eurosceptic. I'd like to raise something that I haven't heard anybody talk about. to what extent should policymakers in Europe and around the world be concerned about, as they approach these issues, Greece's recent, shall we say, coziness with Russia?
Ono.
Thank you, Desmond. Well, great to see you, Anne. And I must say, as usual, I very much agreed with pretty much all you said. I'm also glad that you made clear what austerity possibilities there are otherwise for Greece. I mean, one way or the other, there has to be austerity, and that's unfortunate, but there's no other way. To Ashoka, I would say, I was pleasantly surprised that you mentioned André Saas, who was a mentor of mine for many years. I should also perhaps mention that I was working at the IMF and the European Central Bank both. But I was wondering, Ashoka, if you could tell us more about your forgiveness, all is forgiven scenario. How do you see it when you say, okay, you can stay in the euro, but all your debt is forgiven and there's no austerity anymore? How will that work? There's a moral hazard aspect that's huge, I think.
Okay. Okay. Let's just take a couple more. Barbara.
Barbara Matthews. A comment and a question. A comment, I agreed with a lot of what I heard. I think there's a lot more substantive convergence of thinking. Many of the reform proposals you just put on the table, Plutarchos, were actually in the latest leaked version of the Greek reform plan that appeared in the FT. So a lot of the forest maps, et cetera, they're in there. I don't think that any of the panelists really addressed with any adequacy or at all the fact that there are very real legal treaty limitations to the type of fiscal transfers that can or should have occurred, or the amount of haircuts that the ECB legally could be permitted to take. My question relates to the IMF, however. One of the major frictions inside the fund has been that particularly the 2012 package dramatically increased the concentration and the percentage of the IMF balance sheet exposed to Greece relative to the rest of the world. And while in this city, the US and the Congress and its failure to implement the 2010 reform gets a lot of attention, the fact is that the exposure to Greece was also a major breaking point inside the fund, leading to the perception that the fund was there for Europe, but not for the rest of the world. And I'm wondering, what do you think of the internal IMF politics? How do you worry about the IMF's position globally in light of its exposure to Greece?
Okay, I'll just take one more. Okay, at the back there.
Two very short comments in the same line as the "it's all about politics" comment that was made before. The first one is addressed to Professor Krueger. I would like to correct some facts, because you stated that the Greek minimum wage was the highest in Europe, and according to Eurostat data, it's 683 euros, and in Germany it's 1,473, and the Greek minimum wage fell within the crisis 14%. So even before the beginning of the crisis, before 2008, it was not higher than the German minimum wage. The same goes for the pensions. And I know that it is all over the media, this type of commentary is all over the media, but it's important for the narrative. My second comment, I would like to share a story from when I was working.
If you could come to the question.
It's very, very fast. So when I was working with ECOFIN in the European Union, a German friend of mine who was working on the Greek desk told to me why we do not restructure the Greek debt. He said, in Europe, principles matter more than realities. And that's an interesting fact that I would like to share with you.
Okay, one last question at the back.
So, David Hoffman from the Heinrich Böll Foundation. My question is regarding the political mandate the Greece people gave Syriza, and what happened to Europe when Europe's democracy, when Angela Merkel is always talking about without any alternative. So Europe radicalized. We have next elections in Spain with Podemos, maybe a new win with similar, people are just like, have enough with austerity, and I would like to see what happens if Marine Le Pen wins the election, what happens if Sinn Féin wins the election, what happens with the Portugal left party. So just like, what is happening with the democratic mandate?
Thank you. Okay, maybe, Plutarchos, do you want to start and we'll go that way?
I'll see. I'll try to take some of these questions. Others, I think, are more for others. I agree with the gentleman from the German finance ministry, since I've spent plenty of years in the ECOFIN Eurogroup and myself, that politics overwhelms economics, I think it was said earlier. And I was quite surprised here, because we have a quite American panel that they were quite realistic on that. In the States, there is a complete misunderstanding as to how much more primal politics are and to economics. So, and this is really, I'm very positively surprised, I have to say, and not because I didn't know my other two fellow panel speakers, but I read many of my colleagues from academia that when I used to be here, and I see totally unrealistic understanding of what the European Union is about. Greece and Argentina are two totally different things. Please do not compare them. Argentina was a commodity play. Greece has no commodities. That's it. Greece did a 17 percentage point of GDP reduction in the current account deficit. Only about 1/6 of that came from exports. Okay, I don't want to go into that anymore. So don't compare to. Don't think that what happened to Argentina can happen to Greece. Coziness with Russia. Please don't be concerned. It's this government has been doing a lot of things that I don't understand either, but I'm pretty sure that the core of this government is very concretely anchored on Europe and the European Union, and I don't think it's bad to be exploring other alliances, however these may look to you. On the political mandate to Syriza, I'm not really sure what I can say there. I mean, what I can say, from I've been a European too long, a bit less long than I've been Greek, in the sense that I've spent a lot of time in the States, but I've lived in Brussels and Luxembourg and all that. It's one thing to be elected in your government to do something, but there are 18 other elected governments in the other countries. So you have to basically make sure that you find that compromise. And as regards all these other parties or persons that you mentioned, I think that by far the biggest problem in Europe right now, much more than the economic problem, but maybe because the economic situation is better now, is immigration. Immigration and what happens to immigration and immigration policy is what is going to determine whether more populist, more anti-European, more anti-everything governments come up to the fore. And we are basically at the tipping point. We shouldn't be talking about Greece right now. We should be talking about influx of immigration into Europe. And this is really what I'm mostly scared about. But I will leave the rest.
Thank you.
Thanks. I see we're running out of time, so I will be very brief in touching on just a couple of the questions. Perhaps two of them in particular. On geopolitics, I am far more concerned than Plutarchos is. If the European project is failing, then Europe becomes much more vulnerable to bad outcomes in their geopolitical sphere. Greece is in a terrible situation right now, so I could actually envision, as not being unrealistic, bad decisions being made that would have adverse consequences for the United States and for the rest of Europe. One of the reasons why I consider it really important to solve this crisis is so that we don't have to worry about that in the biggest context. I will also touch on the role of politics that I very much agree with the remark that was made earlier by, I should not say the representative of the German official bodies. I was in personal capacity, I'm sure.
Much more moderate.
Yes, I'm sure. But then I will want to say it's true that the politics of the situation is a big force towards keeping the euro together. I am not sure at all that this is increasing the chances that the project will succeed. And I say this because when I compare what has been happening in Europe in the last 5 years and why it has been so, why the performance in Europe has been so much worse than, say, in the United States, if we use that as a benchmark. The euro area has been losing about 10 percentage point of per capita GDP relative to the United States. That's the result precisely of the domination of politics over economics. We did have very, very simple technical economic solutions that would have avoided for the euro area 10 percentage point loss of per capita GDP and then disaster in Europe. So my concern is that precisely because of the domination of politics, that's number one. And number two, the lack of accountability, I will link this to the demographic deficit that we have, the lack of anybody that has the responsibility to take care of everybody in Europe or everybody in the euro area in designing policies. And instead, we have different governments fighting it out about whose constituencies will benefit more and where losses will be shifted. This does not, the domination of politics does not bode well for the future.
Ashoka.
I can organize my answer around the treaty question. So the question is, the treaties prevent sensible things from happening. And that is correct. That's absolutely correct. And that is why Greece is so important. The fact that Greece is 1% of European GDP is almost irrelevant at this point. What Greece is testing is a concept of of Europe. And when we speak of political reality, we have to ask the question, is the political reality conditioned by a view that we have of Europe? Or is the political reality conditioned by where Europe needs to go? And what you see today, that those who are holding on to an old conception of what Europe means are curtailing the movement of Europe into where it needs to go. And Greece is testing in a way that nobody else can that concept. The treaties will have to be changed, but the treaties will not change in a way that will be a dramatic change. They will erode over time. They will basically be undermined by the reality, because there is a larger force that is causing Europe itself in its original concept to atrophy, which is that public support for Europe more generally is declining. And it's declining for historical reasons, not just because of the crisis. The trade between countries in Europe has steadily declined over time. The young, who were the greatest supporters of Europe, have lost out in this crisis, and their high unemployment has caused them to turn away from Europe, and they're leaving Europe. And the periphery, which thought that the European straitjacket is good for them, have suddenly woken up and said, it's not good for us. So you're seeing a basic questioning of what Europe means. And it's at that edge that the Greek test is being taken by the rest of Europe.
Thank you. I'll try and be quick, too. I certainly agree that the politics has dominated so far, but I have a little bit of a problem agreeing that it will always dominate, and that is because typically what has happened in economies, let me say they're more closed, i.e. they have flexible exchange rates and they want to spend, let's say, beyond their means, 15% fiscal deficit and so on. Typically what happens is the rate of inflation accelerates. And it keeps on accelerating to a point where the body politic can't stand it. I mean, that's the signal that this can go on no longer. And at that point, things begin changing. Some countries have tolerance for more inflation than others and so on and so forth, but nonetheless, inflation in the flexible exchange rate kind of model is a signal that something fiscally has gone wrong. And at that point, the politics change to fighting inflation more painful than the other. What's not happened in Greece is exactly that. So that then becomes the bigger question. What happens when people are voting for something that you can't do? And I have in mind what a friend of mine, a political scientist who I had dinner with at Stanford a couple of, I guess 3 or 4 months ago, it doesn't matter. I said, what are political scientists thinking about this? He said, we've learned an important lesson, and that is that all voters want the government to spend more and tax less. And yes, if you leave it to the voters, they would, of course, love to have infinite GDP, no work, et cetera, but there are some kind of feasibility limits, and Greece has been testing some of those in some ways, and I think you can't completely ignore that, although, as I said, I still think muddling through as likely a solution as any, namely that both sides will give enough to say the thing keeps going. But someday there has to be some reckoning on it. Argentina, by the way, did have some parallels with Greece in a number of ways, in that there was a fixed exchange rate, which they tried to maintain, which did hide the underlying problem until it burst forth. And there is that also in Greece, which is what's happened there. So I don't see that it's totally different, although it's certainly not exactly the same. Okay.
Just, I meant the resolution to the problem cannot be repeated. Not that what led to the problem, but the resolution of the problem with the devaluation and the incredible boom in exports and the reduction in unemployment is impossible in Greece.
Okay, there's also a question indeed as to whether Argentina has really resolved the problem, but we'll let that go aside.
More so to my argument.
Okay, so finally, what was the IMF position on Greece? I share strongly the view that the IMF really has either to reassert its role as the predominant or the main lender, the guider of the program, or there has to be a serious rethinking of some other issues. The idea that the IMF can set a program and the Europeans can then lean on the IMF, well, we got to complete the review, does not seem to me to be a viable alternative for the IMF of the future. But that much said, quite clearly, the IMF did have misgivings, and the IMF has a board that consists still of the United States and the Europeans, between them having a majority of the votes. The IMF staff cannot overrule that, although they can make life more difficult. They can say things that will make executive directors think a bit more. But in terms of just simply saying we're going to ignore this mandate, we're not going to lend no matter what, I cannot be done, unfortunately, in some instances. I'll stop there.
Before I ask you to thank the panelists for the really very lively discussion we had, I just want to mention that I read yesterday that one of the London bookmakers is no longer taking bets that countries are about, that Greece will exit the euro, within the next 12 months. So I thought that, while he might not be wanting to take bets, I just wondered what the probability of a Greek exit within the next year each of the panelists would assign.
Just to say, I have 3 other bookies in my email, which and one of them has just narrowed from 3-1 to 2-1 today. Okay, and I.
Exit or against exit?
Sorry.
3-1 on exit.
On exit, yeah. Now it's 2-1 today on this particular.
Within 12 months.
Sorry.
Is this within 12 months?
I have to see what but for sure it's shorter than 12 months. But my own, I'm not going to give it because I find this exercise of giving probabilities out of my head and without a model as extensive as the Fed model to be totally unscientific.
You could have objected to betting on Puritan grounds as well.
betting I could do, actually. And I trust these, the ones that I see in the book is much more than anything that comes out of my head. I can tell you that.
very briefly, I would say that I'm not going to give you the answer you expect because, frankly, I think the question is ill-defined. Some of the legal issues have been pointed out with the treaty. One of the outcomes that could really mess up the outcomes of these bets is that you could start seeing something else circulating that walks like a currency and quacks like a currency, but is not called currency in Greece, while Greece is officially, legally still in the euro. So how exactly do you define that question? I don't know.
It's like I'm making great progress.
I don't think Greek exit will happen. It's not the incentives against Greek exit are so strongly aligned in the opposite way that Greek exit will not happen.
Do you want me to? Yep. I think I said at the beginning, I still think there's about a 30 or 40% chance that we'll exit within the year.
Thank you very much. If I could ask you to thank